Fundamentally, I believe that every city can find their tech niche, those handful of emerging tech clusters that represent the strongest opportunities for growth. But they need to take a data-driven and targeted approach. They need to identify those strongest opportunities and then go big on a handful of them across sectors and coordinate. And do so in a comprehensive way, where they're linking investments in startups and academic innovation and talent tied to specific clusters.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Signal in the Noise. I'm your host, Dan Gaynor. And today we're sitting down with Nick Lalla. He's an urbanist and executive leader working at the intersection of economic development and emerging technology. Notably, he founded Tulsa Innovation Labs in 2020 and has since authored his book about the experience, Reinventing the Heartland, which we discuss in great detail. He covers things like the framework, strategy, and metrics that make up a new approach to inclusive growth, which was the founding mission of Tulsa Innovation Labs. He talks about reframing the idea of corporate attraction and mainly why it's a big load of BS, and what Nick learned along the way about messaging, communications, and what he calls concentric circles approach to influencing large organizations. So really exciting and tangible lessons learned here. Enjoy this fascinating episode of Signal in the Noise. Hi, Nick.
Hi, how are you doing?
Where are you beaming in from today?
I am on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
You've lived a bit of a national lifestyle. You've lived in a bunch of different places. Walk me through the past decade, all the different places you've, lived for at least a month at a time.
So 5 or so years ago, I was leading the cornerstone initiative of Mayor de Blasio's jobs plan, an initiative called Cyber NYC for the New York City Economic Development Corporation. It's a $30 million public investment in New York cyber ecosystem, really meant to kind of safeguard and grow the financial services sector, which several years ago, cyber attacks were kind of very top of mind. And we got some good press, some New York Times, Wall Street Journal coverage. And this random philanthropy in Northeast Oklahoma cold contacted me and said, hey, we'd love to learn about your work. And I was in FIDI and I said, sure, come on down. Happy to tell you about my work. And in that first meeting, they asked me, have you ever thought about Tulsa, Oklahoma? And I had to say, honestly, with respect, I have not thought about Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was born and raised in New Orleans. Oklahoma is a state or two away. But no, I'd never thought about Tulsa. And was intrigued by the city. I'm an urbanist. I love visiting new places, fundamentally believe in the promise of every community to create good jobs, innovate, invest in themselves, and be their kind of best versions. And got out to Tulsa, multiple site visits, and kind of discovered several things. One, I very ignorantly thought that Tulsa was more southwestern than it is. It actually sits at the base of the Ozarks, so it is wonderfully green, not deserty, and there's no tumbleweeds or anything like that.
The first plug of many I think we're going to have for Tulsa, Oklahoma. So ramp up, folks.
Perception of the city was kind of immediately, blown away. I was like, wow, this is actually a beautiful city, lots going on, and had multiple conversations with stakeholders across sectors. And at the time, they were really interested in figuring out how do they grow their own cyber cluster like New York City was. And ultimately came to the conclusion that an investment or two in cyber wasn't really going to move the needle. They needed to think bigger, they needed to think bolder, they needed to invest in the fundamentals. New York can make surgical investments in emerging tech sectors because its economy is so massive and diverse and relatively mature. But for a city like Tulsa, a mid-sized city in the heartland, they really needed to kind of grow from the bottom up, start with those fundamental pieces to an innovation economy. And so I pitched them a vision for tech-led economic development, and the philanthropy said, that sounds like a pretty good idea. How about you come lead that effort? And so I moved from the Upper East Side of Manhattan to Tulsa, Oklahoma in fall 2019, spun out a tech-led economic development organization called Tulsa Innovation Labs January 2020, right before kind of all hell broke loose, and built that organization for several years. I'm sure we're going to return to that, but I'll maybe put a pin in it and kind of give you the geographic chronology of my crazy life. Exited Tulsa Innovation Labs 4 years later. My husband is a transplant surgeon. He moves from New York to Los Angeles, where he posts up at UCLA for his fellowship. And so I thought that was a good time to exit Tulsa Innovation Labs and write a book about my experience building the organization, living in Tulsa, trying to build an inclusive innovation economy from the ground up. HarperCollins thought that was a pretty good idea, and we signed a contract. And so I spent a year in LA writing the book, which in retrospect feels like a vacation, but it was actually really hard work. No complaints, but it was still really hard.
I think people in LA must have just hated you that you moved to town and got a writing deal immediately. You're like the paragon of jealousy, I'm sure, for many of the unemployed writers out there.
If it was like a Netflix special, I'd say yeah,
Reinventing the Heartland, not so much.
yeah. Unless, Oprah turns it into a miniseries, which you never know, right? So we were in LA. I'm from Louisiana. We moved back to Louisiana for a hot minute after he completed fellowship, and then he got recruited back to Weill Cornell, which is the hospital that he trained at as a resident. So 3 months ago, we moved back to Manhattan almost the week of the book launch. It's been a crazy 4, 5, 6 years.
Truly every time zone. Very, very cool. Let's dive into your career here. I think I did you a disservice. I should have given you more of an honorific intro, but you are an urbanist, you're an exec, you're of course now an author, you're focused on economic development and innovation and inclusive growth. And Tulsa Innovation Labs, I want to hear more about this, but this was a really incredible innovation story, one that I heard about actually through the Harvard Kennedy School. Let's dive into the point of the book and talk a little bit about your journey starting this economic development engine that was really about modernizing the economy in Tulsa and the region beyond. Walk through, in particular, some of the challenges you had in getting started, because that's a startup that's beyond just your own organization. It's one about galvanizing a bunch of organizations, nonprofits, philanthropies, private sector, all to come together. So, how did you do it? How did you get going?
So when I was approached in 2019 or so, I had multiple conversations and site visits with local leaders and heard a few recurring themes. One was that folks recognized that Tulsa was lagging behind peer cities. It's an oil and gas town historically, and they were lagging behind peers in diversifying their economy, in transitioning legacy industries to tech, in building an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Brain drain was a classic problem. And the critique of the city's economic development practices for the better part of a decade was that too many folks were taking a scattershot approach to economic development. One organization would invest in a certain set of areas, another organization would invest in a distinct other set of areas, and there was very little collaboration. Decisions were being made emotionally, not necessarily by data. And big surprise, when you spread capital so thinly across multiple different little bets without any coordination across the ecosystem, it's not surprising that things didn't pay off, right? Things didn't materialize. There wasn't the density of activity, investment to make things pop. And so people were frustrated. Folks were jaded about their own community, about their peers, about themselves, and wanted to mix things up and adjust course. And they knew that they needed to set a different direction. They just didn't quite know how. And I heard all of this and ultimately pitched the city on a different way, which was fundamentally, I believe that every city can find their tech niche, those handful of emerging tech clusters that represent the strongest opportunities for growth. But they need to take a data-driven and targeted approach. They need to identify those strongest opportunities and then go big on a handful of them across sectors and coordinate, and do so in a comprehensive way where they're linking investments in startups and academic innovation and talent tied to specific clusters. And remarkably, we got philanthropic funding very early on. That's what catalyzed this effort. And honestly spent the better part of 2 years advocating for this theory of change, building consensus, building excitement around our vision. We conducted a rigorous study that identified virtual health, energy tech, advanced air mobility, and cyber as the region's kind of core opportunities based on legacy industries, emerging tech clusters that are adjacent to those legacy industries. They represented opportunities where Tulsa could really lead, not just kind of serve as a supporting player. And importantly, those clusters that I mentioned offered jobs attainable across a range of educational levels, right? Which is a really good proxy for inclusion, because we've seen kind of Austin and San Francisco as somewhat of a cautionary tale where innovation economies grow and benefit to folks that look like us, to folks that go to Harvard, right? Or Stanford. And it's really important for a city like Tulsa, which is majority minority, to make sure that opportunities in tech are as accessible as possible. And so that was part of kind of the founding vision of Tulsa Innovation Labs.
Can I double click on that one idea, which was like the inclusive growth metrics that you had? I was looking into this. There's been such a, how do I put this, consternation and difficult conversation around DEI. And what you did here through the Tulsa Innovation Labs approach was to create a framework, as I understood it, that spanned industry accessibility and what you called vibrancy, ranging from the percentage of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, or the labor force participation by gender and race. You really focused on, the fact that I think over half of Tulsa's residents are people of color, and that there's really a low concentration of tech talent. So a lot of what you were talking about was building that workforce from within and taking untapped groups and making sure that they were as competitive in the tech ecosystem as anybody. I'd be interested, like, how would you advise companies based upon your experience, and what was your experience in talking about bringing underrepresented groups to cutting edge industries?
So, inclusive growth was the founding mission and vision of Tulsa Innovation Labs, right? For a number of reasons. One important reason was because, and I think this is a testament to Tulsa and a very positive and defining attribute of the philanthropic sector there, we were launched by a philanthropy whose mission is dedicated to combating poverty across the region, right? And so makes a whole lot of mission alignment sense that we would be dedicated to inclusive growth, because we're backed by an anti-poverty foundation, which I think makes the Tulsa story somewhat special. And I think it's a good lesson learned for cities across the country that they really do need to start from a place of inclusion. When I was at the New York City Economic Development Corporation leading cyber NYC, have to admit, we didn't really start from a place of inclusion. And I think to our detriment. Again, we also saw inclusive growth in tech as a way to differentiate ourselves from competition like Austin and San Francisco. At the time, as you alluded to, this was kind of the apex of the DEI era. And it's really important, given Tulsa's own unique past racial trauma and present social inequality, which is stark, that we are intentional about creating opportunities that are accessible across educational attainment levels, zip codes, races, and genders. And so what we did along those lines was, a lot of organizations kind of leave DEI as an afterthought or pay lip service, make symbolic gestures. We built in inclusion at the very front end of our strategy. We defined our investment thesis through the lens of inclusive growth by really prioritizing that education proxy that I mentioned earlier. And then we wove in DEI related KPIs across each of our initiatives, and obviously we stood up targeted interventions to support particularly underserved populations. We are in a different era than we were 5 or so years ago, right? Where DEI has been weaponized in a lot of ways. It's been maligned, it's been misunderstood. You also have to remember, we're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Not the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And so we had a lot of top cover to advocate for inclusive growth principles because our philanthropic backer is a multi-billion-dollar philanthropy. But when we would go to the State House and meet with governors' offices, cabinet secretaries, some corporate executives who we know don't care about DEI as much as we do, we would have to code switch. What isn't controversial in Oklahoma is investing in tech talent. Corporates need tech talent. The state government wants more tech talent. And so if you broaden the aperture a little bit, avoid unnecessarily incendiary rhetoric, not foreground identity politics and those types of conversations, you're able to move the ball forward without getting tripped up, while still holding true to your values. And if we're talking to other organizations that share our mission and values, then we speak a different language. Today, I think a lot of that advice I think still holds true for different organizations, being able to kind of tailor your messaging and your vocabulary to best resonate with your particular audience while staying true to your values. I think that's probably still good advice. But what I'd also say that Tulsa Innovation Labs has done, I think, an effective and maybe not even intentional job of is making DEI even more inclusive, right? It's not just that the organization is supporting Black entrepreneurs in Greenwood, which they are. It's not just that they're providing scholarships to women and people of color to go to the Cyber Skill Center and get upskilled into cyber and analytics jobs, which they are. But they're also partnering with outlying rural communities on innovation infrastructure. And so I think one of the takeaways of maybe the last presidential election and the kind of new era that we're in is for civic organizations, for economic development organizations, to take a place over race approach, right? You can move the ball forward by foregrounding geographic location and class, right? And one of the examples that I think of is President Trump's Opportunity Zones initiative, which was one of the signature domestic achievements in the first term, large multi-billion-dollar tax incentive to attract private investment in underserved parts of the country. The administration would never admit this, but that is a DEI program. It's just based on geography, not necessarily race, but big surprise, the majority of residents in opportunity zones are people of color. There is a correlation between where you live, the money that you make, and your identity. And so you're able, if you focus on zip codes that have lower socioeconomic standing than other zip codes in your community, you're able to serve the people that need support, that you want to help, without getting tripped up by identity politics if you kind of take a place over race approach, which is also a really great proxy for class, right? And because Tulsa Innovation Labs is now, thanks to federal funding, taking a much more ambitious and broader regional approach to economic development, we're able to impact outlying rural communities, not just Tulsa City proper. I think that's another important dimension to how cities should think about inclusive growth and economic development.
Now, let's talk about the private sector element. You're going to a big company and you're saying, come here. We've got the people to build your business. You have to make the argument against Massachusetts and New York and San Francisco. I'd just be super interested in how you thought about making the case, presenting the value of this community while nascent to some of the world's largest companies. Was it grounded in some of those like key innovation areas you talked about, like drone technology or whatever? Or was it a more tailored approach? And I'm thinking about this through the lens of, if you're working at a big company, perhaps you need to broaden your perspective to the array of partners you're working with, not just like the typical folks. And then simultaneously, if you're a smaller organization, you work at a startup or nonprofit, or you're even part of government, how do you engage at, like the big enterprise level? So I'd just be interested, as you're really experienced being a corporate translator, so to speak, and galvanizing communities, how did you think about going through that approach?
What Tulsa Innovation Labs, so there is an obsession from economic developers, city leaders, civic leaders more broadly, about corporate attraction. And most cities think that company attraction is going to be their saving grace, that they're one big company away from changing the city, growing 1 million jobs overnight, and that their future rests on attracting Amazon HQ2 or a Tesla plant or whatever.
You're right. This is sort of the professional sports theory bias that I have. You're one big star away from winning a championship.
And it's total bullshit in the context of economic development, right? Like you may get Joe Burrow and like your team changes overnight, but in the economic development world, it's just not going to happen for multiple reasons. One is game-changing corporate attraction opportunities are few and far between. There's a reason why Amazon HQ2 was a global phenomenon. There's a reason why the Tesla Cybertruck plant from a few years ago was insane. I haven't heard of any on a similar plane as those recently, but there's few and far between. Like those just opportunities are so rare. And second, those tier one big tech companies with all respect, aren't going to cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma. Amazon HQ2 went to New York and then Virginia or Arlington, Virginia. The Cybertruck plant went to Austin, Texas. Now, Tulsa was a runner up, Tulsa was a finalist in that. And the feedback that the city got from Tesla executives, and I recount this story told to me by my counterpart in the city in the book, they asked, does Tulsa have the world's best engineers? And if not, why would the best engineers want to live in Tulsa? And it's a really hard, impossible question, right? Because Tulsa doesn't have the world's best engineers, and the world's best engineers don't want to live in Tulsa at that moment in time because the underlying fundamentals weren't mature enough. The overall culture wasn't attracting and retaining the world's best engineers. And that, obviously, as a quick aside, isn't the standard that any city should be trying to base economic and workforce development decisions on anyway. But for a company like Tesla that can attract the world's best engineers, that makes sense. And so they went to Austin, Texas. Tulsa Innovation Labs, I recognized that. I lived through Amazon HQ2 when New York got it and then didn't, and fundamentally recognized that the key to success isn't chasing random companies, it's investing in yourself. It is investing in foundational innovation infrastructure and workforce pipelines because those assets attract companies, right? And if you don't have those existing assets, if you don't have high quality, diverse tech talent and a network to upskill them and pivot them into new jobs as industry and technology changes, you're not going to be competitive for Tesla or Amazon. And so it's literally foolish for cities to think that they're going to go out and get these big companies when they're not investing in their K through 12 system or their community college system. And so Tulsa Innovation Labs very maniacally and obsessively focused on investing in local capacity. And so we intentionally let others chase Tesla and whatever the new sexy thing was after Tesla. And we were like, nope, our eyes are on the prize. We're investing in Tulsa Community College. We're investing in the University of Tulsa. We're investing in homegrown startups. We're working with our corporates to attract startups that meet their needs, not the big, huge companies, right? And so we likened it to like economic development broccoli, where you have others on sugar highs chasing the next pursuit. And I get it, it's sexy, it's fun, but we're doing the blocking and tackling of building an innovation economy from the ground up. That's what Tulsa Innovation Labs did. That's as ranty as I probably get.
No. But I love that because I think it's great to question the assumption that I'm bringing to the table, and I think perhaps a few other people probably would have had in their inherent bias as well. But I love your metaphor of the economic development broccoli versus the sugar high of attracting a big, sexy company. It's almost like, well, you have the infrastructure, Mitsubishi or Tesla or whoever else. But no, you build that and you really own that infrastructure in your own city, your own region, then you can really set the terms of the game.
Yeah, and look, it was in some ways a crushing realization because folks threw everything that they had at Tesla and it wasn't enough. Tax incentives, cash, etc. And for a company like Tesla that's rolling in money, that's not the value prop that they're looking for, right? They want talent that can sustain the growth of their company over the long term. And Tulsa just didn't have it yet. And that's okay. So let's invest in building those assets, which will in turn over time make the city more competitive for new firms.
I'd be interested in what you learned through setting up this infrastructure. And by the way, strong arming, cajoling, arguing, convening, whatever the verb might be. And by the way, even in like writing the book and reflecting, what did you learn about messaging? What did you learn about communicating? What did you learn about framing arguments when you're not necessarily in the richest position or the most powerful position?
Yeah, I made a ton of mistakes on that front. And I think I acknowledge this throughout the book, but a few lessons. One was that I very early on, I got the job and got Tulsa Innovation Labs up and running because of a forward-looking vision that got people excited. But what I then did was, okay, let's solve problems to implement that vision and strategy. And so I was, I think, too critical, too early, too often in seeing what I thought were problems and trying to fix them when half the town didn't think they were problems in the first place. And the other half were like, it read as too negative when I should have spent more time communicating, advocating for what was a very positive, forward looking vision that did get people excited. When I turned to implementation and got to the tactical level, it's harder to be optimistic and visionary when you're just trying to get work done. And there are processes, bureaucracies, cultures that aren't amenable to getting big stuff done in a new way, which put me in somewhat more of a defensive posture. And my rhetoric, I think, was probably just too critical, too early. So I acknowledge that. The other thing that I did wrong was at the same time, I was probably like too specific in the vision and too specific in how I was defining Tulsa Innovation Labs' investment thesis. I mean, we conducted a pretty rigorous multi-month study that included hundreds of stakeholder conversations and landed on virtual health, energy tech, advanced air mobility, and cyber, and really specific subclusters within each of those. And then the posture that I took was, well, we have this vision, we have this strategy. Now let's get adoption of it, right? Let's get other organizations to align around it. In focusing so specifically on those 4 clusters, I think I unintentionally
Yeah, you shrunk the pool of people you can engage with.
very, 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 very quickly, right? Because, some folks fundamentally disagree that those are the right areas. Some folks can't, because of bylaws and their mission statements, reorient their work to support the development of those clusters. Others could, but the narrowness, the rigidity was off putting. I wasn't communicating that there are myriad ways to support the development of these clusters. And so in the book, I kind of create what I call the concentric circles compromise, which is to force yourself to zoom out, to recognize that they are outer rings to those clusters, right? In advanced air mobility, and it was really specifically drone testing and operations for agriculture and energy, which shrinks your universe really fast. If you zoom out several layers, then you're talking aerospace writ large, right? That widens the pool of partners. And so I think the point was to explain how we're both being strategically focused and data driven, but also very inclusive in how we're building partnerships, and to walk people through the different ways that they can partner and why it's good for them in a more holistic, inclusive way than I think I did. And I think a lot of that, honestly, is like a messaging challenge that I had, where I was like really hyped on this strategy and like we invested a ton into it. We rocked the process. We got people excited. We got some early philanthropic funding. And I think I naively thought, okay, let's stack hands around it and get it done. Every conversation, every partner requires a more nuanced discussion that meets them where they're at, that understands their value proposition, what they need, and to be able to communicate that in a cogent, compelling way and be open to different types of partnerships, I think was probably a learning that I had as a young then managing director.
But a lot of people listening to this work at big organizations, or they're working for their customer, which is a big organization, whether it's an agency or consulting firm, or you have a job at Microsoft or CVS Health. And I would just be interested on that concentric circles approach that you talked about, whether that framework or another framework came to mind in terms of like how to cajole a big organization, not only around strategic alignment, but then action against that strategy. You talked about early on getting momentum and sort of hoping that momentum would transition towards implementation. But when the rubber hit the road, it was obviously a bit sticky. Maybe the TAM wasn't big enough, so to speak. So I would just be interested. Let's say you're listening to this podcast and you working with a Fortune 500. What are some ways that you can, say, politely cajole, maybe more positively, motivate broad swaths of the organization, even if they're not in your business unit, even if they're not in your function, even if they're not in your country, to rally around a bigger, more ambitious vision. In your case, it was, of course, economic development in Tulsa, but that could be equally true about, launching a new business venture or exploring an emerging market or trying to launch a new product. So I would just be interested in like some broader lesson learned that folks in bigger organizations could draw from this concentric circles approach.
I think we did, I think a few things really effectively, and I can give you certainly the macro example of Tulsa Innovation Lab and maybe a more specific investment that is successful. What I'll say is that pre Tulsa Innovation Labs, what made Tulsa Innovation Labs and that founding vision exciting to folks was you had Fortune 500 leaders and philanthropists recognizing that the city was falling behind. And they were starting to see it hit their bottom line, their ability to attract and retain talent. And so they saw the writing on the wall, particularly in the energy sector, right? Where push toward renewables, climate change, digitization, right? Increasing disruption in that sector. And so these civic leaders knew the macroeconomic challenges, the regional challenges that they were facing. And what Tulsa Innovation Labs did very effectively was, in our strategic planning process, bring them into the visioning and the action planning from day one. And we obviously didn't get 100% alignment, and there are still organizations that don't partner as much as we would like. But in general, we knew the big players, we included them in that process and brought them along the journey. And so we integrated visioning and action planning into the strategic planning process itself with all of the city's major leaders. And so we got buy-in, and we came out of that study with an action plan with broad buy-in. And then what we did was we, investment initiative per initiative, understood what the needs were and co-designed with our Fortune 500 partners initiatives that would benefit their business, right? And the best example is an energy tech initiative called EIC Rose Rock. And the gist is you have multiple Fortune 500s in oil and gas in the region, but there's no corresponding startup scene because those companies weren't attracting startups. They didn't have much precedent working with new firms. They didn't have internal CVC teams. They knew that they need more data scientists and data analysts. They know that they need to pilot new technologies. They know that there's monitors and sensors on all of their critical infrastructure that's giving them so much data, but they don't know how to extract it. They don't know how to make it useful and valuable to the business. And they know that renewables are going to require them, and broader sustainability efforts are going to require them to innovate, right? And for Tulsa Innovation Labs, we wanted to play offense and defense simultaneously. We wanted to protect the long-term viability of those anchor companies because they employ thousands and thousands of Tulsans. That's defense. And we want to grow the energy tech scene and bring new firms and help them all innovate together, right? And so we co-designed with Williams, Devon, ONEOK, and H&P, large oil and gas companies in the region, EIC Rose Rock. It's operated by a Houston-based venture capital firm. It includes a startup accelerator, venture fund, and corporate innovation service. And each of those corporates chipped in $7.5 million to get it done. And it was because we co-designed it from the very beginning. It meets their needs, right? And it meets Tulsa Innovation Labs' needs, right? Which is to innovate and grow new jobs and protect existing industries. And so I think the bottom line is build a vision together, co-design investments, and ensure that everybody has skin in the game.
Love it. Well, an incredible track record of success. You've done it in multiple places. I can't wait to see what you'll do next. In the meantime, very much encourage people to buy the book. Tell the folks, if you don't mind, a little bit of a plug. How can they get in touch with you? How can they get a copy of the book, et cetera?
Encourage folks to follow me on LinkedIn. My name is Nick Lalla. They can go to my website, nicklasslala.com. And Reinventing the Heartland was published by HarperCollins just this March, so they can get it anywhere books are sold.
Fabulous. Well, Mr. Lalla, thank you so much for joining us. This has been another awesome episode of Signal in the Noise. Till next time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.